Why are you not stepping out of the vehicle?
I'm keeping my hands visible. Can you tell me why I'm being stopped?
Are you refusing to follow my commands?
No, I'm complying. I just need clear instructions.
The dashboard clock glowed a faint, sterile green, reading 11:42 p.m., as the heavy tires of the late-model SUV hummed rhythmically against the rain-slicked asphalt of a quiet, winding suburban road just 10 miles outside the perimeter of the military installation. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the silent exhaustion that follows a high-stakes, formal evening. Master Sergeant Marcus Vance, a man whose life had been defined by the extreme rigors of the United States Army Special Forces, kept his eyes fixed on the yellow lines slipping endlessly beneath his headlights. He was still wearing his Army service uniform, the crisp, dark blue fabric feeling unusually restrictive after a night of forced smiles, firm handshakes, and a battalion dining-in event that had run hours longer than scheduled. The rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers was the only sound in the car, lulling him into a state of quiet reflection about the deployments, the dirt, and the men who had not made it back to wear the heavy, polished metal that currently adorned his left breast. Among the rows of colorful ribbons and badges, the Silver Star caught the faint ambient light of passing street lamps, a silent testament to a day in a jagged valley thousands of miles away, where Marcus had made decisions in fractions of a second that determined who lived and who died. But here, on American soil, in a quiet, affluent neighborhood, his finely tuned situational awareness was dialed back to a low hum, anticipating nothing more dangerous than a deer crossing the road. That assumption shattered the moment the rearview mirror exploded with the violent stroboscopic flashes of red and blue. Marcus did not flinch. His heart rate, conditioned by years of combat, barely registered a spike. He calmly checked his speedometer, noting he was exactly 3 miles under the posted limit, signaled his intent, and smoothly guided the heavy vehicle onto the damp shoulder, bringing it to a controlled halt beneath the dim glow of a solitary, flickering sodium street lamp. He shifted the vehicle into park, turned off the engine, and rolled down the driver's side window before turning on the interior dome light. It was a practiced, deliberate sequence designed to project transparency and compliance. He placed his hands firmly on the top of the steering wheel at the 10 and 2 positions, keeping his fingers splayed and visible. In the side mirror, he watched the silhouette of a police cruiser idling behind him. The high beams were blinding, intentionally washing out his vision and creating a wall of light. A door slammed. Footsteps approached, heavy and cautious against the wet gravel. Marcus waited, his breathing even, anticipating the standard request for license and registration, mentally preparing the polite, measured responses he had been taught to use in any interaction with civilian law enforcement. What Marcus did not know, and what he could not have known, was that 3 miles away, a frantic dispatch call had just gone out regarding an armed robbery at a late-night pharmacy, perpetrated by 2 men who had fled the scene in a dark-colored SUV. He did not know that the officer approaching his window, a young patrolman named Hayes working his 4th consecutive overtime shift, was running on fumes, caffeine, and a dangerously high level of uncalibrated adrenaline. Hayes was not walking up to a traffic stop. In his mind, he was walking up to a felony intercept. This was the critical juncture where procedure was meant to serve as a guardrail against tragedy, but the guardrails were already beginning to buckle under the weight of human assumption. The beam of a high-powered tactical flashlight suddenly pierced the interior of Marcus's car, striking him directly in the eyes. Marcus blinked, turning his head slightly to protect his vision, but kept his hands firmly planted on the steering wheel. "Keep your hands right where they are," the officer's voice barked over the sound of the idling cruiser. The tone was not authoritative. It was tightly wound, bordering on panicked. It was the sound of an officer who had already bypassed the foundational steps of a legal stop and escalated directly into a state of combat readiness. "My hands are on the wheel, officer," Marcus replied, his voice deliberately low, steady, and devoid of inflection. He did not move a muscle. "How can I help you tonight?" "I said don't move!" Hayes shouted, stepping closer to the B-pillar of the vehicle, using it for cover while keeping the blinding light trained on Marcus's face. "Driver, with your left hand, slowly reach down and open the door from the outside. You are stepping out of the vehicle." It was right here, in this span of 5 seconds, that the invisible, unyielding architecture of the United States Constitution entered the damp night air, specifically the 4th Amendment, which protects citizens from unreasonable searches and seizures. In the realm of constitutional law and standard police procedure, an officer cannot simply command a citizen out of a vehicle at gunpoint or under the threat of force without a clearly articulated legal foundation. The officer must have reasonable suspicion, a specific, articulable rationale based on objective facts that the person is involved in criminal activity, to justify a Terry stop. Furthermore, to escalate a stop to a physical detainment or a search, the officer must possess probable cause, meaning there is a reasonable basis for believing that a crime may have been committed by this specific individual. Hayes had neither. He had a vague description of a dark SUV on a wet night. He had not run the plates. He had not observed a traffic violation. He had allowed the adrenaline of a radio call to bypass his training, conflating a mere hunch with probable cause. Marcus, intimately familiar with the rules of engagement and the precise escalation of force from his years in special operations, immediately recognized the procedural failure. He knew that arguing constitutional law on the shoulder of a dark road with a highly agitated officer was a dangerous game, but he also knew that stepping out of the vehicle into the blinding lights without establishing a baseline of communication could trigger a fatal misunderstanding. "Officer," Marcus said, his voice remaining impossibly calm, a stark contrast to the aggressive shouting coming from outside. "I am going to keep my hands exactly where they are. My wallet and identification are in my breast pocket. I am a master sergeant in the United States Army, returning from a function at the base. Before I reach for anything, or step out, I need to know why I am being ordered out of my vehicle." It was a perfectly reasonable request, grounded entirely in the rights afforded to any citizen, but to Officer Hayes, operating under a severe cognitive bias that had already cast the driver as a fleeing felon, the question itself was interpreted as non-compliance, defiance, and a potential threat. In high-stress situations, the human brain often relies on heuristics, mental shortcuts, to process information quickly. When an officer is improperly trained to view every question as resistance, those shortcuts can lead directly to catastrophic errors. Hayes did not hear a citizen asking for legal justification. He heard a suspect refusing a direct order. The procedural flaw compounded upon itself. Instead of de-escalating, instead of taking a breath, stepping back, and communicating his reasoning, Hayes made a fatal assumption. He assumed the worst. "Step out of the car now, or I will remove you from the car," Hayes yelled, his free hand dropping to his duty belt. Marcus heard the distinct, unmistakable sound of molded kydex snapping open. It was a sound he had heard thousands of times in training environments and combat zones. It was the sound of a weapon being drawn. He braced himself, his mind calculating the angles, the distance, the lighting, but he forced his body to remain perfectly still. He did not turn his head. He did not speak. He breathed. The harsh, metallic clatter of the heavy tactical flashlight hitting the wet pavement echoed in the night as Hayes dropped it to free both hands. A moment later, a different kind of light filled the cabin. It was not the blinding white of a bulb, but the sharp, piercing red of twin laser emitters. The distinct hum of an X-26P Taser charging broke the silence. Marcus looked down. The two red dots were dancing erratically across the dark blue fabric of his uniform. One dot rested near his collarbone. The other dot, vivid and sharp, was painted directly onto the center of the heavy, star-shaped silver medal pinned above his heart. The Silver Star, an award given for gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States. An award earned in a dusty compound where Marcus had dragged two wounded teammates to safety under heavy machine gun fire, absorbing a ricochet in his own shoulder to ensure they made it onto the medevac bird. Now, a laser sight from a local police officer's less lethal weapon was painting a target directly over the medal that symbolized his willingness to die for the very rights that were currently being ignored. "Hands where I can see them! Unbuckle the seatbelt!" Hayes commanded, his voice cracking slightly, betraying his own mounting panic. He was holding the taser with a two-handed grip, his finger resting dangerously close to the trigger, pointing it point-blank through the open window at a man who was sitting perfectly still. "My hands are on the wheel," Marcus repeated, his voice dropping an octave, taking on the commanding, authoritative tone of a senior non-commissioned officer who was used to bringing order to chaos. "You have a taser pointed at my chest. If I move my hands to unbuckle the seatbelt, you are going to see a sudden movement, and you are going to pull that trigger. I am not moving. You need to call your supervisor, and you need to run my plates." It was a standoff born not of malice, but of profound procedural incompetence and the dangerous assumption that authority requires immediate, unquestioning obedience, regardless of legality. For agonizing seconds, the only sound was the heavy rain beginning to fall again, tapping against the roof of the SUV and the electronic hum of the taser. The red dots trembled on the silver metal, highlighting the deep engraving of the star. It was in this incredibly fragile moment where a muscle twitch or a sudden sneeze could have resulted in 50,000 volts of electricity surging through the heart of a decorated war hero that the heavy static-laced voice of the police dispatcher crackled loudly over the radio on Hayes' shoulder. All units be advised. Suspect vehicle in the pharmacy robbery located. 2 individuals in custody at the corner of 4th and Elm. Cancel the bolo. The words hung in this damp air. The tension did not evaporate instantly. It fractured, slowly and awkwardly. Marcus watched the red dots on his chest. They stopped trembling. Then, slowly, they lowered, sliding off the silver star, down his uniform, and disappearing as Hayes lowered the weapon. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and deeply uncomfortable. It was the silence of an absolute, undeniable realization of error. Hayes stood by the window, the taser still in his hand but pointing at the ground, the rain slicking his hair. He looked at the man in the car, truly looking at him for the first time. He saw the crisp uniform. He saw the rows of ribbons. He saw the silver oak leaf rank insignia on the shoulders. He saw the calm, unblinking eyes of a man who had faced death and was distinctly unimpressed by the young officer holding a stun gun. I need to see your license and registration, Hayes stammered, attempting to retreat into the safety of protocol, a protocol he had entirely abandoned 3 minutes prior. No, Marcus said calmly. First, you are going to holster that weapon. Then you are going to call your watch commander to this location, because you just bypassed every procedural safeguard in your manual, violated my Fourth Amendment rights, and threatened to deploy a weapon on a compliant citizen without a shred of probable cause. Hayes swallowed hard, the reality of the situation crashing down on him. He holstered the taser. He walked back to his cruiser. 10 minutes later, a sergeant arrived. 15 minutes after that, a liaison from the provost marshal's office at the military base, awakened by a very specific and urgent phone call from the local precinct, pulled up to the scene. The base verified exactly who Marcus was. They confirmed his status, his clearance, and his identity. The apologies from the local police sergeant were profuse, nervous, and ultimately meaningless. They spoke of misunderstandings, of a dark night, of a vague description. They tried to smooth over the rough edges of a deeply unconstitutional encounter with handshakes and nervous smiles. But Marcus did not smile. He took his license back, rolled up his window, and drove home. In the real world, the cinematic narrative of instant justice rarely plays out. There was no immediate firing. There was no dramatic courtroom confession the next day. The aftermath of that night was a slow, grinding, bureaucratic marathon that revealed a far deeper, systemic rot within the department's training protocols. Marcus did not let it go. He retained legal counsel, not merely seeking a personal apology, but aiming a spotlight at the severe procedural failures that had nearly cost him his life or his career. A lawsuit was filed under 42 U.S. Code Section 1983, citing the deprivation of civil rights under the color of law. The initial defense, predictably, leaned heavily on the doctrine of qualified immunity, a legal principle that shields government officials from civil liability unless they violate clearly established statutory or constitutional rights of which a reasonable person would have known. The city argued that Hayes was acting in good faith based on the dispatch call. But the discovery process is a relentless mechanism. Through depositions, body camera footage, and internal training documents, Marcus's legal team meticulously dismantled the city's defense. They proved that Officer Hayes' actions were not a momentary lapse in judgment, but the predictable result of a department culture that routinely encouraged officers to manufacture probable cause, to treat any hesitation as resistance, and to use the threat of force as a primary tool for compliance rather than a last resort. They showed a pattern of unconstitutional stops, of officers drawing weapons on unarmed citizens without articulating reasonable suspicion. The case dragged on for 3.5 years. It consumed Marcus's free time, testing his patience in ways combat never had. But he approached the litigation with the same cold, tactical precision he applied to a mission profile. He wasn't fighting a physical enemy, he was fighting a flawed system. The resolution, when it finally arrived, was not a triumphant verdict read by a jury, but a massive, quiet settlement designed by the city to avoid a public trial that would have mandated federal oversight of their police force. The settlement was finalized at $14.6 million. It was a staggering figure, but the money was merely a metric of the city's liability. The true victory lay in the binding consent decree attached to the settlement. The 14, $6 million forced the immediate restructuring of the department's use of force policies. It mandated comprehensive annual training on Fourth Amendment protections, de-escalation tactics, and the strict legal distinction between reasonable suspicion and probable cause. It required the implementation of a new early warning system to track officers who frequently drew their weapons without discharging them, a direct countermeasure against the casual intimidation tactics Hayes had employed. The monetary value was the lever required to force systemic evolution. It was the heavy price a municipality had to pay for allowing assumptions and adrenaline to override constitutional law. Marcus directed the vast majority of the funds into a trust dedicated to providing legal aid for veterans and civilians who had experienced similar violations of their civil rights, ensuring the impact of that night echoed far beyond his own life. The reality of law enforcement is complex, dangerous, and demanding, but the foundational rules governing it exist precisely because the power granted to the state to detain, search, and use force against its citizens is inherently dangerous if left unchecked. When a badge becomes a shield against accountability rather than a symbol of public trust, the entire system fractures. The incident on Route 87 was not an isolated clash of personalities. It was a microscopic view of a massive structural vulnerability. It demonstrated how easily the immense weight of state power can be brought to bear on a single, innocent individual based on nothing more than a flawed assumption and a failure to adhere to the strict, necessary procedures designed to protect us all. It reminds us that the rights enshrined in the Constitution are not self-executing. They require constant, vigilant enforcement, and sometimes they require a citizen to sit perfectly still in the dark, with a laser painted on their chest, and demand that the law be followed. If a man who has survived the most brutal battlefields on earth, wearing the highest decorations of valor his country can bestow, can find himself mere seconds away from a violent escalation due to a simple traffic stop procedural failure, what does that mean for the average citizen who does not possess the training to remain calm under the threat of sudden force?